Hello, my name is Brant Hunt. My channel is Discerning What is True. The day is the 8th day of March 2023. Going to continue another chapter from this good book by Eustace Mullins, The Rape of Justice. And the chapter is called The Department of Justice. And we're going to go into this particular book continually. It's an important book out there. I have, hopefully, in the near future, I'll be doing this particular book by Eustace Mullins, dedicated to Ezra Pound, who actually had enormous impact upon Eustace Mullins, very much large impact upon his life. And Eustace dedicated this book to Ezra Pound also. Good information about another man who stood against the system, Ezra Pound, and was treated horribly by our government. Unfortunately, they don't give any compensation about that, do they? Our government is way out of control, folks, way out of control. But anyway, let's get into the chapter here as I share with you tonight. The Rape of Justice, chapter 7, Department of Justice. Welcome all here. Again, I am on YouTube with my channel, Discerning What is True. Also on Odyssey with the same name, Discerning What is True. And appreciate you all being here. So let's get into the book. I hope you enjoy. Department of Justice. Most Americans believe that they have in Washington a superior bulwark of their liberties, not above the Constitution, but existing to bring the Constitution in life and prosecuting violations of their freedoms. This bulwark is known as the Department of Justice. Unfortunately for our comfortable supposition, the Department of Justice exists and was created not as a bulwark of justice for the citizens of America, but as an instrumentality by which political crimes could be committed against us. Congress created the Department of Justice in 1870, almost a century after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. That's also 1 year before the whole thing that took place with in the District of Columbia in 1871, which really did radical changes in our country. Again, based upon what I've understood is to do with the country basically declaring bankruptcy and then setting itself up as a corporation and no longer a country. Most people are not aware of this. It kept that in disguise immensely. One of the writer I would say that would be good for you guys to look into is I've quoted from him. Actually, I didn't quote, but actually Eustace Mullins quoted from him. As Lysander Spooner. If you can find anything by him, read it. Probably gutsiest person I've ever seen. Stood up for what was right. Very few people, his mentality, thinking, very simple way of following him also. All right, back to the book here. Congress created the Department of Justice in 1870, almost a century after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The century prior to the creation of the Department of Justice was a period of unparalleled growth and prosperity for the American nation. The century since its creation has been a period of steadily decline. How did this happen? America's inaugurated its existence as the land of opportunity, the land of freedom, and the land of justice. Of the three, justice was always the most unattainable, but it existed in however warped or inadequate a fashion. After 1870, the activities of the Department of Justice served to remove the possibility of attaining justice in the courts permanently beyond the reach of most Americans. This does not mean that justice could not be had. It was always there for the fortunate few, those who had created the Department of Justice and who subsequently benefited from its creation. The Department of Justice, by its very nature, has no permanent bias or prejudice in its mode of operation. It exists solely to serve its creators and directors, that is, the PIP, or party in power, which is also known as the perverts in power, because of their prosperity for perverting every aspect of American existence. Although all government departments in Washington are permanently tainted by political opportunists, the Department of Justice is the most reprehensible because it is advertised as the final arbiter of our problems. Of all the departments, the Department of Justice is the most flagrant prostitute, boldly advertising that she will do anything for her pimps. The present writer has advised the Department of Justice routinely over the past 30 years of serious criminal acts committed which fall directly within the purview of this department, because these letters are sent registered with return receipt required. The department has regularly answered these notifications and as regularly has refused to take any action. Reported violations of civil rights are met with the identical Department of Justice response, usually in a sneering tone that I should hire myself a private attorney if I really think that my rights have been violated. Notification of routine theft, using the mails to defraud, and conspiracy to defraud, all amply documented, have been met with the same response that I should have hired a private lawyer. It's the same Department of Justice which recently spent some $40 million to determine how Colonel Oliver North paid for a couple of tires. When I wrote to Mr. Oliver Buck Revell, that is, in 1986, the current acting director of FBI, complaining of contentious violations of my copyright in my book, Secrets of the Federal Reserve, I received a response dated May 28, 1986, that the FBI pursues criminal investigations and prosecution of copyright matters generally in the areas of sound recordings, motion picture, and audiovisual works. Wow. The FBI was not instituted a criminal investigation relative to this matter. Few people know that the vast resources of the FBI for years has been diverted to protecting the profits of a few Hollywood film moguls, who are also among the largest donors of political funds to national campaigns. FBI resources are confined to stopping unauthorized copies of these moguls and films and records. Faced with the refusal of the FBI to act in this matter, I went into state court and later into federal court with several lawsuits against violators of my copyrights. In each instance, the judge intervened actively on behalf of the defendant, and my complaints were consigned to the wastebasket. The overt activity of the Department of Justice on behalf of the political powers that be is proved that the 5,000 lawyers do work to earn their salaries. When not carrying out humanitarian errands for party bosses, they may be found conspiring with the dreaded KGB to commit atrocities against American citizens or indulging in their favorite pastime, volunteering to carry out hatchet jobs against critics of the state of Israel. From one point of view, the Department of Justice may be acting to protect the public. One shudders to think what the effect might be if its 5,000 lawyers were suddenly discharged and unleashed upon an unsuspecting public. The consequences would be calamitous and could bring on the total collapse of the nation. A visitor to these hallowed halls complained that the marijuana smoke was so thick in one office that he couldn't see to read his brief. For some decades, the Department of Justice has been the first stop out of law school for arrogant young graduates from Harvard, Columbia, and Yale. Typical was the revelation at the height of the Watergate imbroglio that one young Department of Justice lawyer had become quite popular at parties in Washington and New York in return for supplies at Acapulco Gold. He was playing the super secret Watergate tapes at liberal yuppie parties and was a hit of the circuit. The episode was a one-day source of gossip and was quickly forgotten. Since the advent of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933, the Department of Justice has been unrelentingly liberal in its bias. The long parade of Republican White House advisors convicted and sent to prison reflects not only the power of the Democratic Congress, but the overwhelming prejudices of the department attorneys. Like the Supreme Court, the Department of Justice can be said to have read the election returns, but its interpretations of them occurs only on a much lower and more petty level. The dedication of department officials to statism, more aptly known as Marxism, has never been a secret in Washington. However, in recent years, there have been rumors of two conflicting philosophies of government in the Department of Justice. In fact, the most actively rivalry and longtime opposition to the fanatic sects had now come to roost in the halls of justice. In 1933, with the sudden dominance of the Stalin wing of the Communist Party, that is, assuming absolute direction of the Democratic Party, government officials vied with each other in exhibiting their newfound loyalty. Large posters of Lenin and Stalin were placed in offices and homes of prominent officials. The Internationale was routinely sung at weekend parties hosted by these officials, and earnest students could be seen poring over the latest edition of Stalin's speeches from the international publishers. However, these were mere tokens of fanatic loyalty. These officials were not token communists. They were actively engaged in espionage activities in our halls of government. Members of the notorious Harry Ware cell, W-A-R-E, presided over by Felix Frankfurter and his ubiquitous proteges, who were known as the Happy Hot Dogs, were named to key roles in the Department of Government. Longtime government employees who have served ably and well at very low salaries were now shunned to the background, irreversibly tamed as good Americans. Few of these unlucky ones could ever boast a foreign accent. The Stalinists remained firmly in control of the Democratic Party for many decades. Meanwhile, a rival group had been headquartered in the United States, the followers of Leon Trotsky, who were committed to world revolution now. They bitterly opposed the Stalinists, you see, who echo Stalin's dictum of socialism in one country, that is, Russia, although a purer form of communism had now been established on the banks of the Potomac, perhaps the only genuine communist government which has ever existed anywhere. In 1940, Stalin, fearing Trotsky's divisive influence on the brink of world war, had him hacked to death in Mexico City. The Trotskyites now had a martyr and a cause worthy of continual financial support by the various Rockefeller tax-exempt foundations. The Trotskyites finally came to rest under the aegis of the League for Industrial Democracy, a shallow name for the old Socialist Workers' Party. The Trotskyite movement in America, you see, firmly committed to the principles of Marxism and Trotsky, doctrines of world revolution now. The League for Industrial Democracy began to infiltrate conservative American groups. After 1948, the LID became, that is the League for Industrial Democracy, became the nesting place for most fervent Israeli propagandists in the United States. First advertising themselves as neo-conservatives, they gradually became more militant and viral and anti-Stalinist. In 1980, with the election of Ronald Reagan as president, the LID, masquerading behind its vocal contacts in the Hoover Institute at Stanford University, seized control of the Reagan administration. Reagan unwittingly found himself playing the Hollywood role of General Custer, completely surrounded by Indians at the Little Bighorn, while his few remaining genuine conservative supporters were chopped down. The Trotskyites now had total power in the White House. They wrote viral speeches for Reagan to deliver, denouncing the Moscow regime as the evil empire and threatening to avenge the death of Trotsky by an all-out war against the Soviets. The reality of international politics forced them to tone down these toxins, but they continued to develop anti-communist regimes in Latin America. After the Goldwater election fiasco, the neoconservatives, the neocons, the Trotskyites, who now consider Tel Aviv as their Kremlin, moved in control of the Republican Party by default, as the Eastern control, the traditional Wall Street direction of the Republicans floundered under the uncertain leadership of Nelson Aldrich Rockefeller. In Nicaragua, the neocons found their golden opportunity. For decades, Nicaragua has been the playground of such banking houses as J&W Silliman Company and Brown Brothers, now Brown Brothers Harriman, and the family firm of President George Bush. The Nicaraguan dictator, General Alberto Somoza, invited some Israeli entrepreneurs into his country in the hopes of quick profits. They made millions for him, but abused the people so mercilessly that a reaction took place. The Sandinistas, a Stalinist communist group, seized power and exiled Somoza, whom they subsequently murdered, and seized the Israeli enterprises. The Israelis began to finance the opposition movement called the Contras. This is what it's all about, folks. When Reagan came into the White House in 1980, the neocons sought U.S. financing for the Contra movement in the hopes of recapturing the Israeli business in Nicaragua. However, the Democratic Congress, still firmly committed to the support of Stalinist communists throughout the world, refused to allow the U.S. support of the Contras, as an impasse developed which had paralyzed the American government for almost a decade. The Kissinger neocons, led by his personal protege, John Poindexter and Oliver Norr, as supervised by Elliot Abrams of the Department of State, as the son-in-law of the Israeli powers, Midge Decter, D-E-C-T-E-R, and Norm Ponhorsger, I'll spell that for you, Pocores, Podhoretz commentary, the actual publication of the American Jewish Committee, sought to finance the Contras through tax-exempt donations. Congress then forbade Contras support by the Boland Amendment. Punish those who supported the Contras. Congress sought to take over the executive branch of government. The traditional system of checks and balances was thrown overboard as Congress appointed special prosecutors to crucify North and other scapegoats and neocons. Even trials, the traditional purity of the executive department were taken over as Congress staged spectacular televised Moscow show trials of its victims, such as North in the grand tradition of Joseph Stalin. The American public, totally bemused by the spectacle of two wings of the Communist Party battling to the death in Washington like insane pit bulls, was never informed by the certified press, which was now largely under alien domination, about the true nature of the struggle. Meanwhile, the economy, the nation's borders, the environment, the military, and other responsibilities of national government were abandoned, leading the nation to flounder and then to sink into total disarray. Another expensive and well-publicized Department of Justice operation had been in mad pursuit of Nazi war criminals, almost a half-century after the event, a campaign whose equivalent would be the indictment of Soviet officials of the present regime for mass murder committed during the purges of the 1930s by Stalin. All these alleged crimes took place outside of American jurisdiction. The law merchant principles of our legal system allow the U.S. government to take action against persons who later became American citizens. That is, Justice set up the Office of Special Investigations, which acted as the U.S. office of the KGB, and also worked closely with the Mossad, Israeli intelligence, to manufacture evidence against several elderly American citizens who were claimed to have been guards in German concentration camps nearly 50 years ago. Many millions of dollars were expended by the OSI to have these elderly victims deported and executed. One of the principals of the OSI was Nate Lewine, who mysteriously became the compulsory lawyer of choice for Republican White House executives accused of influencing peddling and other offenses. Nate Lewine began his lucrative career at the Department of Justice as a top operative of the Get Hoffa, Hoffa squad at the department. This may have been the cause of John F. Kennedy's assassination. He's a former roommate of Philip Heyman, President Carter's director of the criminal division at the Department of Justice and now at Harvard Law School. Walter Sheridan, chief of the Get Hoffa squad, was the dirty tricks mentor of the operation. This group leaped to the defense of Stephen Bryan after he was accused of passing vital defense secrets to the Mosaic. Bryan is now on the staff of his longtime associate, Assistant Secretary of Defense Richard Pearl. The vicious assault on John Tower when he was nominated as the Secretary of Defense was masterminded by the Mosaic group at the defense. They feared that he might balk at their continuing espionage on behalf of Israel. The notorious Office of Special Investigation had been organized as a behest of Congressman Elizabeth Holtzman, albeit by Heyman and Lewine. It was set up specifically as a dirty tricks unit of Mosaic and the KGB operating in deep cover at the Department of Justice. Lewine's clients usually went to jail after paying him millions of dollars. His first defended congressman was George Hansen, Hansen, who was charged with failure to properly fill out ethics reporting forms. His real offenses was that he had gone to Iran to try to free American hostages, thus invading the sacred preserves of the Middle East, which had long been the property of Mosaic and Israeli politicians. Hansen paid Ludlin $1 million to be sent to federal prison, where his treatment was so brutal that 258 congressmen petitioned the Bureau of Prisons to alleviate his suffering. Millions of Americans deluged Reagan with demands that Hansen be paroled. All of these requests were thrown into the wastebasket at the White House by the sneering neocons who held Reagan captive. Michael Deaver, Reagan's closest confidant, was the next victim. Lewine charged him $3 million. Deaver was convicted. Americans had shown little reaction to the possession of Moscow show trials, which had been held in Washington since the Watergate episode, the scandal of the century in which a Democratic office was burglarized by Republican henchmen. White Republican White House executives have been tried by black Democratic juries and convicted in every instance, the latest being Oliver North. This is not racism on the part of the juries as much as it is the Moscow process, in which Democratic Stalinists are sworn to convict Republican Trotskyites, neocons, no matter what the charges or the evidence against them. This mockery of the judicial process is typical of the law merchant court system, which functions solely on power and money. No legal standards need apply. The Office of Special Investigation evolved into a small conspiratorial group of fanatics who assumed control of all Department of Justice operations. This group was known as the Nesher, N-E-S-H-E-R, the Hebrew word for eagle. Its origins may be found in the book by John J. Dziak, I guess I'm going to just D-Z-I-A-K, historian of the Defense Intelligence Agency, or Checksis, A History of the KGB. Dziak exposed a worldwide espionage and assassination bureau run by the KGB through Dr. Max Eidelson, a close personal associate of Sigmund Freud. It was Eidelson who brought the use of psychoactive and drugs into international espionage. He also prepared the documents for the 1937 secret trial, which resulted in the 9 top generals of the Soviet army being executed. These documents were later revealed to have been prepared by Hitler's Gestapo. Eidelson had cooperated fully with Reinhard Heydrich to prepare this evidence with the same techniques which were later employed by the U.S. Department of Justice to use fake evidence from the KGB to have American citizens deported and executed by the OSI. Among the many murders arranged by Max Eidelson was the murder of Trotsky's son, Leon Sedov, S-E-D-O-V, in a Paris hospital. Rudolf Kleist, K-L-E-I-S-T, a German Trotskyite whose decapitated body was found in the Seine, S-E-I-N-E, and Walter Krivitskis, a KGB defector who was murdered in Washington Hotel only a few feet from the halls of Congress. Eidelson's brother ran the foreign espionage operation of the KGB, the expense being paid by the income from the Soviet Fur Trust. Max Eidelson set up the Berlin Psychiatric Institute, whose graduate later came to the U.S. to establish branches of the Tavistock Institute, which I've already read by Dr. John Coleman, probably the best book I know of anything about Tavistock, the British Army Doctor of Psychological Warfare Operation, which has systematically brainwashed officials of the major U.S. foundations and educational institutions. The Eidelson group, known as the Killerati, pioneered in the use of drugs and psychiatry and espionage coups, and techniques became the basis of the British Secret Intelligence Service and its subsidiaries, the CIA, the Department of Justice takeover by Nesher. The spawn of this unholy group provided a happy meeting ground for the essentially hostile forces of the KGB and Mossad. Provided with unlimited funds by the American taxpayer, they were unable to carry out their sinister worldwide campaigns of systematic murder and destruction in every nation of the world. Nesher financed hit teams to assassinate Palestinians who were cooperating with the U.S. government, thereby ensuring the continuous chaos in which Israel feeds throughout the Middle East, and it resulted in taking of U.S. hostages not as a retaliation against the United States, but as a protection against further assassination attempts by Mossad. Nesher ousted Duvalier, I guess he's the president there, or in Haiti, creating widespread chaos and suffering in that nation. Meanwhile, Nesher's principal officers in the U.S. government, Jonathan Pollard, was busily securing thousands of pages of vital U.S. documents for his Israeli employees in order to assure further economic chaos and further diplomatic catastrophes for our nation. Pollard operated under the aegis of Undersecretary of Defense Fred Ike, I-K-L-E, whose Swiss connection is now involved in a vast scandal. Ike's 2 principal aides were also prominent in Nesher operation, Richard Pearl and Stephen Bryan. They set up another front group, the JINSA, the Jewish Institute for National Security Affairs, as a cover for their fugitive operations, working closely with Moscow Procurator and Soviet Attorney Natalia Kalinskova, and the mastermind of the Iran Gate affair, David Kimchin, the director of Mossad, who was Pollard's controller. The Pollard cover-up was led by Department Attorney General Arnold Burns and Nate Lewin of Nesher. Burns' law firm handled the books for the Lansky syndicate operation through Sterling National Bank. Burns set up 15 illegal tax shelters throughout Israeli connections, which currently invaded some $40 million in taxes. As the investigation, Burns' operation was stopped by DJ's head of the criminal division, William Well, of the Wall Street banking family, who's controlled the Bank of Boston funneled payments to Pollock for his espionage operations. The breakdown of the Nestor Group was found to originate in the Swiss espionage and banking industries, one of whose proctors, that is Tabor Rosenbaum, had financed the Israeli conquest of Palestine. Swiss law enforcement was headed by Elizabeth Eich Kopp, K-O-P-P, cousin of Assistant Secretary of Defense Fred Eichelin. She was married to Hans Kopp, who headed a billion-dollar holding company for espionage group operating worldwide. The Shankarachia Trading Company, the Shankarachia, handled enormous sums for CIA, Mosaic, and other espionage operations. $10 million of Iran-Contra proceeds from the illegal sale of arms to Iran was first deposited in the Chase Manhattan Bank in New York by Arab wheeler-dealer Anat Khashoggi. The money was then transferred to Credit Suisse and later laundered by Shankarachia executives. I'll spell that to you. S-H-A-K-A-R-C-H-I. So it's Shankarachia executives. This money paid for the delivery of 1,000 TOW missiles to the CIA for clandestine delivery to Iranian terrorists. As a result, investigations into Iran-Contra dealing, both Kopp and his wife are now under investigation, while Khashoggi, K-A-S-H-O-G-G-I, languished in a Swiss prison. The case is expected to uncover interesting corollaries between the international drug cartel, the international espionage, and Israeli intelligence. The Department of Justice was formerly headed by Ronald Reagan's friend, Edward Meese III, who publicly denounced the American Civil Liberties Union. Meese was hounded from office and forced to hire Nate Lewing as his personal attorney to defend him against a host of charges, none of which were ever proven. Meese was then replaced by a Republican from the Eastern Liberal establishment, Dick Thornburgh, former governor of Pennsylvania. Thornburgh had formerly been a director of the ACLU, American Civil Liberties Union. Wow, not a good group. He now heads some 77,000 employees at the Department of Justice and has announced his intention to dismantle 14 regional strike forces against organized crime. Under Meese, the personnel at the Department of Justice had grown by 34%, while his achievements dwindled by the point of invisibility. Thornburgh had developed a cozy relationship with Merrill Lynch stockbroker firm while governor of Pennsylvania. His largest expenditures was the authorization of an $807 million bond issue to improve the rapid decay in Pennsylvania Turnpike. He later became a director of Merrill Lynch at a salary of $35,000 a year. Merrill Lynch, formerly chairman, that is Donald Regan, was President Reagan's chief of staff in the White House. The Department of Justice continues to offer a spiritual homage to personnel who could be most generously described as cooks, K-O-O-K-S. The Washington Post of March 11, 1989, recounted the strange tale of federal prosecutor Judy Russell, who had been widely hailed as one of the most promising young attorneys in the United States. She faked death threats against herself and was diagnosed as schizophrenia. With 4 distinct personalities, she was found not guilty of obstructing justice by reason of insanity. The FBI continued to offer money to a host of odd personalities. A well-known member of the Richmond, Virginia City Council, Henry Richardson, had pleaded guilty in February 1988 to the possession of dangerous drugs and drug paraphernalia. He was fined $50 and received a contract from the FBI to finger other drug users in the city government. His attorney, Michael Morkhauer, reported in an AP release April 29, 1989, that Richardson may have flim-flammed the FBI of $6,000. Mr. Richardson sent the FBI on a wild goose chase with information that had no value. Richardson later admitted his heroin addiction and was being done for $10,000 for his cure in a local institution. Attorney General Dick Thornburgh, who had been chosen for this cabinet post by President George Bush, promised to take the Department of Justice on a new and even more liberal tack. When we remember that George Bush campaigned actually against the ACLU, His opponent, Michael Dukakis, boasted that he had long been a member of the ACLU. Throughout his presidential campaign, it became more puzzling that as soon as he ascended to the White House, Bush immediately chose for his most secretive cabinet post a director, yes, that's right, of the ACLU. Thornburgh then announced his most crucial appointment, the selection of a deputy attorney general. His name was Robert Fisk, Jr., a choice which caused crisis of rage to emanate from most Republican conservatives. Fisk has long been notorious as a liberal agent of the ABA, American Bar Association, from 84 to 87. As a dominant member of the ABA screening committee, Fisk had passed on to the most vociferous liberal activist organization the names of prospective judicial nominees during his years of screening. These activists then dug up the entire history of each nominee, carefully scrutinized if, for any reason, sign of pro-Americanism. Those who had failed to make ritual obesity to the national obediency, the nation's most powerful behind-the-scene liberal forces, had their names tossed in the wastebasket. Only those who tried and true liberal records were given the ABA nomination were given the ABA recommendation for nomination. The result was that the nation's judicial system became loaded with judges whose personal history embraced drugs, sexual liberation, and who openly espoused the most violent principles of viral left-wing organizations. The ABA screening process was not as important during the administration of Democratic presidents. Jimmy Carter was notorious for the legal activists, some 300 judges whom he stalked in the nation's court. He stacked in the nation's court. However, during the Republican administration, the ABA screening process was crucial to the Stalinist Democrats as he means to subvert and stall Republican programs. Judges who were suspected of being conservative encountered a phallus of opposition in the ABA screening committee. In 1985, Fisk was forced to admit that he had indeed sent the names of Reagan's prospective nominees for conservative judicial posts to such well-known liberal activists as the Alliance for Justice Judicial Selection Project to determine if the nominees had any approval records of bias towards women or minorities. See how this is all stacked, folks. The result that Reagan nominees encountered months of stalling, open animosity, and in many cases denial of their nomination for judgehood. When Thornburgh nominated Fisk as the Deputy Attorney General, it was sent by the Washington insiders as a payoff to the saboteur for his career as a notorious wrecker, destroys Reagan's chances of nominating a more conservative judicial branch. Fisk, whose mother was Seymour of a prominent Wall Street family, had become a partner in the prestigious Wall Street firm of Davis, Polk, and Warwell. One of Washington's most respected legal observers, Paul Kamirnar of the Washington Legal Foundation, described Fisk as basically a liberal-type minion, Wall Street lawyer, country club-type Republican. Although the previous Attorney General, Edwin Miss III, had left office under a cloud, having become involved in the notorious WEDTech scandal, the WEDTech, WEDTECH scandal with the State of Israel, he may be vindicated when one looks at the record of his assessor, Dick Thornburgh, a Yale graduate and longtime personal friend of President George Bush. Thornburgh is also a protege of Don Regan, President Reagan's former White House chief of staff and head of the giant stockbroking firm called Merrill Lynch. Thornburgh not only became a director of Merrill Lynch, he also is a director of the giant scandal-ridden drugstore chain, Rite Aid Corporation. The schism of the Rite Aid family, Martin Gross, was arrested in room 158 at Cleveland's Sheraton Airport Hotel. Prosecutors had seized him as he was in the act of handling a $33,000 check to Melvin Silinski, a voting member of the State Pharmacy Board. In return, Mr. Wadazinski had signed an undated letter of resignation from the pharmacy board. The entire incident was videotaped by prosecutors. We had also recorded 4 prior telephone conversations between Grass, former executive vice president of Rite Aid, who had been recently named president of the firm, and Leskinski. The news of the arrest caused Rite Aid stock to tumble $1.875 per share, down to 34.75. Rite Aid is the nation's largest drugstore chain with 2,270 stores and 28,000 employees. It owns 65 auto parts stores, ADAP, and a 40-store chain of retail bookstores, Encore. It also owns a dry cleaning chain known as Begler, BEGLEY Corporation, of which Martin Grass is director. That's interesting. Rite Aid's not even, I don't even think Rite Aid's even in business anymore. If they are, they're not what they used to be, for sure. Rite Aid's overwhelming interest in the Ohio State Board of Pharmacy was due to its acquisition of 162 Gray Drug Fair stores in 1987. Rite Aid had 349 stores in Ohio. Members of the State Board of Pharmacy had fined Rite Aid $50,000 on January 1989 for allowing non-pharmacy employees access to prescription drugs. The board had previously refused to allow Rite Aid a grace period to correct the many drug security problems which were endemic in its stores. The Wall Street Journal account of the affair, intensity that is, stated that Martin Grass had planned to submit Mr. Walensky's resignation to Governor Richard J. Celeste, who, as Grass told Walensky, had agreed to appoint pharmacists chosen by Rite Aid to fill full future vacancies at the State Pharmacy Board. Prosecutors alleged that Rite Aid was attempting to stop the Pharmacy Board from proceeding with enforcement action against it. Investigators had learned that the Grass plan, to which Celeste was claimed to be a party, was to replace 3 members of his pharmacy board with Rite Aid supporters and to oust the board executive director. 90 of the Grace Drug Fair stores acquired by Rite Aid had been raided in a 2-day period and charged with not having proper security alarm systems as well as other violations. In New York State, that is, Rite Aid had become involved in another imbroglio when the firm's vice president for governmental affairs and trade relations threatened to boycott the New York State employees' prescription plan when new rates were proposed in 1986. The Federal Trade Commission then charged Rite Aid with illegal forcing an increased reimbursement rate on prescription, a move which subsequently cost New York State an added $7 million in charges. A well-known Wall Street drug chain analyst noted that Marty wanted to show his father that he could handle anything which came up during his presidency. At this rate, he will never be named president of the Federation of Jewish Philanthropists. The position carried great personal prestige in the community. The analysis was referring to the record of Marty Grass's father, that is, Alex Grass, a Miami lawyer who had married into a hierarchy of Rite Aid stores. He married Lois Lehman, Lehrman. Lehman family are the chief stockholders of Rite Aid. Grass later became chief operating officer of the giant drug firm, leading to his zooming to a prominent role in community philanthropy. He's currently listed as chairman of United Jewish Appeals, the Israeli Endowment Fund, the Jewish Federation, the Jewish Agency for Israel, and the Israel Center for Social and Economic Studies. He's the brother-in-law of the well-known neocon Louis Lederman, who led in the purchase of the Republican Party by wealthy neoconservatives in 1980, while he was still president of Rite Aid stores. Lederman ran for governor of New York, breaking all spending records in his campaign, which was unsuccessful. Although his campaign of loyalists assured him that a Jewish candidate can't lose in New York. He insisted on spending $7 million for TV ads, while his successful opponent, Cuomo, spent only $1.5 million. Cuomo campaign workers had also assured him that he could not lose, telling him that a Roman Catholic Italian can't lose in New York. When the votes were counting, they were right. Lederman then promoted himself as an arch conservative, endowing his own right-wing think tank, which he modestly named the Louis Lederman Institute. Lederman is also chief financial backer of such well-known conservative groups as the Heritage Foundation, which is led by the British Fabian Socialists, and the American Enterprise Institute, both of which are Rockefeller-sponsored agri-prop operations masquerading as a right-wing political groups. They control both sides, folks. They control all the right wing and they control the left wing, no matter who it is. That's how they stay in control. That's how they control even politicians. Lehman had already won some recognition, principally through his favorite magazine, the National Review, as the ideological genius behind President Reagan's famous supply-side revolution. Lehman was also an ardent advocate of the gold bug principle of the French economist Jacques Ellul. Lederman then became the mentor of a former liberal, that is, David Stockman, who had switched sides when the Republicans gained the ascension, when Stockman and his cohorts, that is, Jack Kemp, now Bush cabinet choice as head of the giant health and education welfare boondoggle in Washington, published a controversial report early in the Reagan administration warning of an approaching economic Dunkirk. It was common knowledge in Washington that they had merely plagiarized an earlier Legerman report, reaching the same conclusion. In 1977, Louis Legerman placed $3 million of his rapidly burgeoning personal fortune into Legerman's Institute, which he installed in a luxurious Manhattan townhouse. Then Legerman announced his intention of running for the governorship in New York. Legerman's family stock at Rite Aid was worth $92 million, of which Louis Legerman's share was $60 million. During his campaign, the stock increased in value by 10 points, reaching a high of 40 on the exchange. Wall Street analysts apparently believed that the Rite Aid firm would benefit financially by having its principal stockholder in the governor's seat. In fact, Legerman spent some $10 million during his campaign, while his stockholders in Rite Aid increased by $15 million, meaning that he had realized a tidy increase of $5 million in his personal fortune by seeking public office. This was a unique twist to the usual patterns of events in the United States political domain, whereby poor farm boys dedicated themselves to a life of public service and wound up with $50 million worth of corporate stock, as did the late Lyndon Baines Johnson received. Louis Legerman has long been one of the very small group of gods in William Buckley's pantheon, routinely utilized in the pages of the CIA Acroplot sheet, the National Review. Legerman's company companions in this strange pantheon were Sir James Goldsmith, a relative and partner of the Rothschilds of Europe; Bill Casey, director of CIA; Jeane Kirkpatrick, known as Miss Israel of the Washington set; and Milton Friedman, the tireless spokesman of the Rothschilds, Vienna School of Economics. These guys were known collectively as neocons, intelligently slang for neoconservatives, who were well represented on the board of directors as a Trotskyite priesthood in the United States. The Rockefeller Finance League for Industrial Democracy, the old Socialist Workers' Party, that is to do with the martyr Leon Trotsky, a victim of Stalin's incendiary urge to kill him. The Rockefeller fascination with Trotsky dated back to the very early days of 1917, when old John D. himself saw Trotsky off to spark the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia. John D. charitably stuffed $10,000 in Trotsky's pocket as he embarked on his career of world revolution, a startling departure from Rockefeller's standard gift of one dime to those whom he approved. Despite Legerman's image as a loser, which was compounded by his aura of great wealth and his habit of buying those whom he wished to impress, the pages of the National Review sparked with tributes to Legerman's great deeds and peddling aspirin to the public. William Buckley also had a daily newspaper column, which he rolled out his big guns to support Legerman's candidacy on October 26, 1982, praising Legerman as a brilliant public servant who was also prominent in Jewish affairs. Legerman later discovered that hardly anyone in New York read Buckley's outpourings, which may explain why he lost. Frustrating his drive for the governorship of New York, which would bring the coveted White House into view, as witnessed the strange career of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Legerman threw his money and influence behind the political career of Jack Kemp, who proved as difficult to sell to the American public as Legerman himself. National Review described Kemp as the political fudgeman of the Law Lewington Economic School. Despite Legerman's influence and backing, Jack Kemp's quest for the presidency, along with Legerman's other political ambitions, sank without a trace. Legerman's fortunes originate with his grandfather, a illiterate peddler whose principal stock, as his grandson was fond of recalling, consisted of shoelaces and sugar. The grandfather finally accumulated enough cash to open a small grocery store, which, as so often happens in a climate of creating wealth, becomes a large wholesale grocery chain. When the accountant reports showed that the profits from drugs preceded the much smaller returns on meat and potato, the elder Legerman went into the retail drug business. After the millions had piled up, his grandson, Lou, was able to marry a Protestant, that is, Louise Stillman, a member of the New York most prestigious banking family and the historical bankers of National City Bank, which is now Citibank, of Rockefeller's billions of income from Standard Oil, the world's most successful monopoly. Two of the Stillman daughters had married into the Rockefeller family, which brought Lou Longman into the family golden aura. As a student at Harvard, Lou Longman was awarded a Carnegie Teaching Fellowship and a Woodrow Wilson Fellowship. It had long been a truism in the most august Ivy League established that great family wealth should not be considered a deterrent to a student receiving fellowship, even though the donors may have originally intended them for a needy scholar. Alice Grass, the Miami lawyer who married Lou's sister, was also prospering with Rite Aid. The political campaign, which increased Lou's fortune by some 20%, had a corresponding effect on Alex and his wife, Lois Holdings. However, Alex Grass became oppressed by growing envy and dislike of his more famous brother-in-law. The situation was deftly profiled by writer Michael Kramer in New York Magazine. Grass promptly filed a $24 million defamation suit against New York, on which nothing has been heard in recent years. Kramer noted in New York's issue of April 5, 19, from lengthy discussion with Rite Aid executives that Alice has always been jealous of Lou. Wow. There's been considerable infighting within the firm for years, as Alex and Lou each battle to support his claims that he and he alone had been responsible for the phenomenal growth of Rite Aid and its burgeoning profits. No mean published itself. Alex Grass has chosen to promote himself through immersion in Jewish affairs, finally achieving the most desired position in Jewish philanthropy when he was named national chairman of the United Jewish Appeal. Letterman continues to devote himself to public affairs, hiring Robert F. Kennedy, dynamic speechwriter Adam Walensky, to draft his pronunciations. The rivalry between the relatives finally subsided when Letterman withdrew from active participation in the firm, and Alex was able to name his son as president. Insiders believe that it was Grass's fanatic determination to show up Lou, which led to the Marty involvement in the Ohio bribery scandal. As previously noted, the deep involvement of the new Attorney General with the scandals of Rite Aid raises serious questions as to motives of President Bush's drive for a kinder and gentler America, but not necessarily a more honest one. In addition to Thornburg, other directors of the Rite Aid firm are Richard Kogan, president of the drug firm Schleicher Floyd, a $3 billion operation. I'll spell that to you: Schering, Floyd, P-L-O-U-G-H. Kogan also has a reckless London connection, being a director of one of England's big five banks, National Westminster, which provided the most recent choice to head the Bank of England. Kogan's federal directors at Schering Floyd included William A. Schreiber, chairman of Merrill Lynch, Harry McGraw, chairman of the Business Publishing Group, that is Giant, McGraw-Hill, Virginia Dreyer, director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, Eaton Corporation, Georgia Power, and the Southern Company, which has been much in the news recently, and James Wood, chairman of A&P Company. Federal agencies have shown no curiosity as to whether Kogan's position at head of one of the nation's largest drug manufacturers poses a conflict of interest with his position as director of the nation's largest retail drug operation. Other directors of Rite Aid are Leonard Stern, Philip Neverd, Henry Toth, and Gerald Zera Jr., formerly known as the Boy Wonder of Wall Street. Zera is now chairman of the holding company Primerio, which owns the Wall Street investment firm Smith and Barney and Company, and Continental Life, as well as Finger Hut, a textile firm grossing $800 million a year. Director of Primeria included Washington's most famous wheeler dealer, Joseph Califani Jr., known as the highest-priced lawyer lobbyist in Washington, and former Secretary of Health, Education, and Welfare, the world's largest boondogger. Charles Hugel, H-U-G-E-L, also director of Primerio. He is chairman of the Combustible Engineering Company, one of the nation's most permanent components of trade with Soviet Russia, and USTEC, US Tech, the secretive business organization which is desperately trying to salvage the collapsing economy of the Soviet Union. All expenses to be paid by the American taxpayer, and to rescue the Lenin Marxist philosophy of government from well-deserved oblivion. Californio serves with Huger on the board of Combustible Engineers. Huger is also chairman of the RJR Nabisco. That was RJR is Reynolds, the tobacco company giant. They took over Nabisco. But Nabisco is no longer that anymore, neither. Which Nabisco stood for North American Biscuit Company, is what it stood for. Ackermans, director of Pitney and Bowes, and director of the Eaton Corporation, the creation of the late Cyrus Eaton, a protege of John D. Rockefeller, who became famous for his connections to the Soviet KGB through his sponsorship of the mysterious Pugwash Conference, P-U-G-W-A-S-H conference, and who was advertised for years in the American press as the nation's most pro-communist financier. The final director of the present Rite Aid Corporation to attract our attention is Henry Taub, T-A-U-B, chairman of the giant automated data processing corporate, 1.38 billion a year. The firm finances are handled by manufacturer Hanover Bank in New York, the Rothschild Bank, and according to little-known congressman hearings, its directors include Alan Greenspan, a director of J.P. Morgan Company, who's now in charge of the nation's monetary system as chairman of the Federal Reserve Board of Governors. Joseph Califano, previously mentioned, Lauren Tisch, the tycoon who swallowed the CBS media giant, and Frederick Millay, known as one of the pillars of the fallen Nixon administration. Although Rite Aid officers and directors have been historical connections with the fate and embattled Middle East countries such as Israel, none are more prominent than Henry Taub. He is a director of American Telecom, which provides funds for Israel's burgeoning science industry. The bank, the Nomia Trust, which fights to take over Palestine from the air through Tabor Rosenbaum of Switzerland and Points West and other Jewish agencies. A former director of Rite Aid and prodigy of the Letterman political drive is Maxwell Rabb, R-A-B-B, the great eminent of the Eisenhower administration, who for many years has represented American interests as the United States ambassador to Italy. Another prominent Washington wheeler dealer who interlocks with Rite Aid is H. Guyford Stever, director of Shotgun Plug, who has held many important government posts in such agencies as NASA, the National Science Foundation, president of Carnegie Mellon University, chairman of the US-USSR Joint Committee for Science and Technology, board of governors of the Israel Science Foundation, and director of the giant defense contractor TRW Corporation. Stever is a member of the exclusive Cosmos Club of Washington and the famed Bohemian Club of California, where the elite meet to plan their personal goals for the great American future. The next paragraph. The sinister combination of banking and legal interests exposed in these connections has been itemized in great detail in this writer's book called The World Order. Confirmation of its conclusions are to be found in dramatic show trials held in Washington in recent years, in which persons suspected of conservationism were deliberately pilloried by the devotion of one world, the historical liberal political movement. To protect themselves in the courts, these special interests have gone to the great lengths to ensure that their cases would be heard by judges who were proven to be sympathetic to their hidden goals. The instrumentality has been an agency of which few Americans have ever heard, the American Bar Association Standing Committee on the Federal Judicial. This relatively unknown, I've never even heard of this group. I've heard of American Bar Association, but Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary, never have. This relatively unknown group, elected by no one, has exercised a virtual veto power over judicial nominees for many years, confining its approval to those prospective judges with an extensive record of service to its largely unpronounced but well-known and well-understood goals. An editorial in the Wall Street Journal of March 22, 1989 noted that politics, disguised as objective evaluation characterized by the ABA, quasi-official role in judicial selection during the Reagan years. The Washington Legal Foundation, a public interest group, is now suing the ABA because the Standing Committee refuses to give this conservative foundation information on nominees, which it has willingly shared with left-wing groups. The Standing Committee has maintained its principles of closed deliberations and secretive voting, much like its precepted, the secretive Federal Board, Reserve Boards, Federal Board of Governors. The WLF, the Washington Legal Foundation lawsuit, was based on the ABA's well-established record of sending information on prospective judicial nominees to the NAACP, People for the American Way, the American Civil Liberties Union, and other prominent liberal operations, while steadfastly denying this information to conservative groups such as the WLF. Again, that is standing for the Washington Legal Foundation. The ABA processes ensure the nomination of liberal activist judges, which now plague the American bench and which represent the rape of justice for most Americans who do not fall into that category. The Washington Legal Foundation maintains that the investigations, have been conducted and are continuing to be conducted in such a way as to penalize or discredit candidates who hold or profess conservative principles or ideology and delay or prevent their nominations by the president. In response, the ABA maintains that it only investigates the judicial temperament of nominees, but fails to explain why it only sends the names of prospective judicial candidates to the left-wing organizations. The ABA committee member Stuart Dunning has testified that they wanted to confine its judicial selection to candidates who have an affirmative action committee commitment. Susan Liss, LISS, director of the People for the American Way, revealed that it was routine for the ABA to give the names of potential candidates to the Alliance for Justice, an umbrella group of the civil rights group organizations such as the NAACP and American Civil Liberties Union. This practice allows these groups to mount an offensive against prospective candidates long before their names had even reached the president, or before conservative groups could defeat them, or defend them, I should say. Senator Orrin Hatch described this process as follows. It exercises a virtual veto over our judicial nominees. Senator Gordon Humphrey also forcefully objected to the senator behind the scenes operation of the ABA, stating to the Senate Judicial Committee that the system is a molding, corrupt, malodorous old relic which should be given a quick burial for the sake of public health. Senator Humphrey then wrote a letter to President Bush complaining that during Robert Fisk's tenure as chairman of the ABA Standing Committee, there's evidence that committee evaluations were tainted with ideology bias against conservative nominees selected by President Reagan. He stated that Fisk had leaked the names of prospective nominees to activist liberal groups, which could target them for provisos even before their names had been announced to the public. Despite these protests, Attorney General Thornburgh announced on June 2, 1989, that his choice of Fisk as Deputy Attorney General still stood, and that he intended to continue to send the names of prospective judicial nominees to the ABA Standing Committee. Thornburgh claimed that the committee had promised to change its liberal bias, whereupon the committee members promptly retorted that they had not changed and had no intention of changing their methods of approving judicial candidates. They continue to deny that religious or philosophical stands of candidates affect their conditions of approval, despite the fact that the Wall Street Journal editorial page gave considerable space to the protest of Arthur Schwab on April 11, 1989, that the ABA had blocked his judicial appointment for religious and political reasons, mainly because he was a practicing Christian. He submitted a 20-page recitation of his complaint concerning a 3-year investigation of his candidacy by the ABA. His nomination to the Third Circuit Court of Appeals in Pennsylvania was withdrawn by President Reagan because he could not win approval by the ABA. The committee member assigned to question him, Jerome Shystak, is known as one of the most liberal of the 15-man standing committee. He pointedly asked Schwab why his children went to a Christian school, even though the ABA claims that they do not take religion affiliation into account in approving prospective nominees. Shystak was also a director of the far-left Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights under Law and served under Joe Biden for presidential committee, even while the ABA was masterminding the Biden Judicial Committee assault on Robert Bork. The determination of the world order to prevent the selection of any judicial appointees who was not committed to their Signature International program has not only been a rape of justice, it has been the handmaiding of the rape of the entire American people. The consequences of this campaign are now raging in Washington, what has been called a feeding frenzy, as conservatives take their revenge for the outreach committee against their candidates during the past 30 years by the ABA Standing Committee on the Federal Judiciary. The liberal conspiracy against conservative candidates reached its apology of the Moscow show hearings on the candidacy of Judge Robert Bork for the Supreme Court, followed by the widely leaked ABA report on his nominated successor, Judge Douglas Ginsburg, who was said to have smoked a marijuana cigarette some years ago. The greatly overextended Bork hearings caused a breakdown of American confidence in the process of government, which was reflected in the 500-point drop in the stock market in October 1987 crash. This was followed by the prosecution of Congressman George Hansen on charges of ethical violations, charges which were based on the fact that he had not entered some items on the proper line at a time when most congressmen admitted they did not know how to properly fill out the newly required forms. Hansen, a Republican and a Mormon from Western State, Idaho, was pillared because he had long been an outspoken critic of brutal abuse by agencies such as the IRS against American citizens, because he had interfered in the politics of the Middle East, because Hansen had flown to Iran to try to secure the release of American hostages and thereby imperil a billion-dollar operation of the Chase Manhattan Bank. He was chosen for crucifixion. None other than Nate Lewin, The Department of Justice and famous Office of Special Investigation was hired to defend Hansen. Lewin charged Hansen $1 million to defend him. Hansen was duly convicted on orders of Messiah for having dared to barge into the sewer of Middle Eastern political conspiracy, where he was not wanted. He served every day of his sentence in the most brutal of the federal prisons, the brutal prisons at Petersburg, Virginia. Despite pleas from 258 congressmen that he be released on parole, he was judged too dangerous to the minions of the world order to be allowed early parole, despite the fact that the court records showed he had not profited from the alleged violations. The brutal treatment meted out to Congressman Hansen alerts some congressmen to the fact that they had to fight back or be destroyed. They now went after the most notorious of wheeler dealers in Washington, the Democratic Speaker of the House, James Wright. Wright was one of the most dedicated left-wingers in Congress and had upheld the Stalinist war against Trotsky after Republicans' efforts to aid the Contra movement in Nicaragua. A list of 69 ethical violations was drawn up against Wright, although the Wall Street Journal stated that the original list had number 116, but had been cut almost in half by those who wished to protect Wright from the consequences of his own actions. That don't make any sense. Why would you do that? Anyway, at the height of the investigation, Wright was further compromised by a family matter. His personal protege, John Mack, whose brother had married Wright's daughter, was found to have received extremely favorable treatment after committing one of the Washington area's most shocking crimes. In 1973, Mack had lured a 20-year-old girl into the back room of a discount store where he was employed. He seized a hammer and smashed in her skull. Oh my God! In her skull with repeated blows, exposing her brain and 5 ears. He then stabbed her 5 times in the breast near her heart, leaving part of her heart exposed, and then slashed her repeatedly across the throat. He then carried the body of his victim, Pamela Small, to a car and drove her to a remote area where he left her for dead. Amazing enough, she revived some 8 hours later and drove to an Exxon station where she persuaded the attendant to get her to a hospital. She then underwent 7 hours of surgery. Her left lung had collapsed and her heart required extensive repair. Mack was subsequently arrested, and powerful influences swung into effect to defend him. He was merely charged with malicious wounding. He received a 15-year sentence instead of being sent to state prison. He served his time to the county jail where he worked as a cook. Congressman Wright had written to the judge offering Mack a job even before he was sentenced. Holy shit. With this opportunity awaiting him, Mack was released after 27 months. Wright obtained a job for him in the congressman's mailroom at $9,000 a year. The present writer earned a mere $1,500 a year as a deck attendant at the Library of Congress, but had no congressional patron. As Wright's influence grew, so did that of his protege. John Mack became the executive director of the Democratic Steering and Policy Committee and was described by reporters as the most influential congressman staff administrator on Capitol Hill. However, Mack's victim continued to live and work in the Washington area. Several years ago, in 1987, Wright's office summoned the leading newspaper in Washington, the Capitol Hill reporters for the Washington Post, the New York Times, and the Wall Street Journal for a consultation of the Mack affair. The goal was to prevent an approaching firestorm about the small assault. These reporters, including the CBS representative, agreed that it was an old story and that it had no foreseeable interest. Reporters now admit that they blew it. What seemed more likely is that they had the opportunity to curry favor with the most powerful politician in Capitol Hill, Jim Wright, who was third in line for the presidency of the United States, and that they did it the Washington way. When the story broke in the Washington Post on May 4, 1989, the usual efforts of the damage control was taken. Wright issued a statement to the press that he was not told the details of the crime, apparently giving the impression that he thought Mack had been charged with jaywalking. Come on, man, get over it. That's ridiculous, jaywalking. You can make up a better lie than that. Good grief. Wright's statement praised Mack as a exemplary and truly inspiring person. Outstanding, remarkable capacity for intelligent growth. Other Democratic leaders joined Wright in his effusion of praise for Mack's accomplishments. His wife was serving as executive assistant to Congressman Maurelius, a leading Democrat. In fact, Mack had exhibited the highest qualities for political activity, instinct for the jugular, bloodlust, capacity for direct action, such as a cold-blooded attempt murder. This writer has repeatedly lectured on the elements of criminality in those who seek political office. Mack now verified his strongest statements on the matter. In the face of Democratic choices of praise for his remarkable human being, stories of other acts committed by Mack surfaced. The Democratic flag list of defenders were shaken by the defections of several racial feminists who were alarmed by the fact that Mack had never apologized for his acts or sought to make any restitution to his victims. She had taken care of her own hospital expense. Congresswoman Pat Schroeder and other women on Capitol expressed their unease at having to deal with Mack in their political lives because Mack's defense of his actions had been that he had been under stress. Washington travel indeed is very stressful, it's upon. Schroeder publicly showed concern that he might again be overtaken by stress while she was in his office discussing Democratic Party politics, of which he was the final arbiter. In the face of these protests, Wright suggested to Mack that he had better resign, a decision which was motivated by the fact that Wright was now battling for his own political survival. Mack's departure did little to help him, and Wright finally announced his own resignation. The Associated Press noted that he received a standing ovation from his colleagues in the House. Another leading Democratic liberal, Congressman Tony Collario, then announced that he was resigning as Democratic Party whip and leaving politics. He found it difficult to explain to his associate with the junk bond team, Michael Milliken, who earned $500 million last year and apparently tried to share the wealth by cutting Cleveland on a deal or two. The Post revealed that Congressman Thomas Robertson had a 22-year-old model on his staff who was being paid $60,000 a year. He owed her father, that is $100,000, Jerry Jones, the wealthy oil man who owns the Dallas Cowboys. Wow, isn't it a strange world? The Republican National Committee, in commenting on Collier's imminent departure, responded to a spirited defense of John Mack, who happened to be his business partner, that it was the second time that Collier had come to the defense of a man convicted of attack on a woman. This was followed by an apology from the committee after being informed that the first time Collier had defended a man convicted of an attack, it had been only on a boy, not on a woman. Such are the pitfalls of describing the public sewers of Washington, D.C. Although the press delicately reframed dwelling upon the details of Collier's intervention on behalf of a convicted felon, the New Republic, in its issue of June 12, 1989, noted that the congressman had not only intervened on behalf of his business partner and personal political confidant, John Paul Mack, but also on behalf of David Weischer. Weischer was the son of John Weischer, a 1982 Collier campaign contributor who had donated several $1,000s to the cause of Collier. He now asked Collier to intervene on behalf of his son, who was about to be sentenced for the crime of his first-degree murder. This crime was brutal enough to be compared to Mack's assault. Weischer had kidnapped, tortured, and killed a retarded youth because he feared the youth might testify against him in a burglary case. Weischer choked the youth, then stabbed him, beat him fiercely with a baseball bat, and forced him to dig his own grave. According to this account of his accomplice, he threw the youth into the grave while he was still alive, seized the shovel, and threw in the earth, burying his victim alive. Weischer immediately went to bat for the murder, contacting the judge and giving him to understand that an influential Washington politician, he had a deep concern over the case. The judge apologetically informed Collier that he could do very little about the sentence, as conviction for this crime now carried a mandatory sentence of life in prison. In the wake of Wright's resignation, economist R. Emmett Tyrrell Jr. noted that one of Wright's aides had been in prison for tax evasion, while Wright's press aide and right-hand man in dealing with the media, George Mara, had written a Tillerton work in 1982 titled The Sex Book Digest, a peek between the covers of 113 of the most erotic, exotic, and edifying sex books. The Democratic Party had maintained control of the House of Representatives with a coalition welded by Franklin D. Roosevelt in the early 1930s with the able assistance of Bela Monakovsky, a leading New York communist organizer. This was a consensus of communists, blacks, the mafia, and various other special interest groups, such which exercised iron control over the corrupt political machines of the nation, largest city. Although this weird coalition could control the House, it could not deliver a presidential majority, resulting in a Republican administration held at bay by activists and fanatic communists and Zionist Democratic alliances. Paralyzed by this impasse, the nation sank into deeper disarray, its assets being stripped by a horde of eager aliens, while the infrastructure built at such cost and efforts by previous generations rotted to oblivion, seemingly beyond repair. Alarmed Democrat leaders with the blood of Robert Bork, John Tower, and other presidential appointees on their hands now shirk that the feeding frenzy must end. The Department of Wright, Mack, and Carter should have satisfied those who mourned the ritual slaughter of George Hanson, Robert Bork, and John Tower at the hands of fanatic Stalin's Democratic congressional hit team. However, Republicans leaders noted that this still had long lists of other Democratic stalwarts with even longer lists of ethical and financial violations. Despite the rape of justice, the struggle goes on. Wow. Wow. Despicable, isn't it? Both sides. Both sides, folks. Not either side. I'm not taking sides from either one of these sides. It's unbelievable. So that's the conclusion of chapter 7 tonight. And hopefully some of you will see that this is an important book, again, by Eustace Mullins, The Rape of Justice. And you can see why many of the people who live in this country are, this has gotten even worse in this country now. This was 30, 40 years ago, folks. 1990, basically. So that was 32 years ago. How despicable it was then, what do you think it is now? And if you see your country going completely bananas, I mean, not bananas, but basically we have major inflation in this country that is not going to be solved. This country is headed for a fall, folks. There's no doubt about it. And part of it's being done by design. And you can see how the pillage was taking place back then, 30 years ago, over 32 years ago, this was taking place. And how sadly our state is now. And I don't mean the state where I live in, I'm talking about all people. If you think people are bad, you arrest people for stealing a dinner or whatever. These people up there in Washington are despicable. They're not worthy of any respect. They're not worthy of any honor. These are criminals. All of them are. I'm sure that the Republicans are not any better. And as he said, that basically it's like two parties. That is the Russian-Soviet deal with the Stalinists, and then the other one, the Trotskyites. Interesting. Okay. All right. Thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. Thank you for your time. Appreciate you doing this for me. And hopefully this is telling you the true story of what has happened in the past. And if that was in the past, by far it's a terrible past, isn't it? And I was approximately only 30 years old at that time. So completely didn't even know. I knew certain things that was going on, but no, they didn't. They never gave you all this information. You'd have to be in the Wall Street Journal every day reading what was going on, good or bad. So thank you for listening. Have a good night. Again, take care.